The famous Jewish rabbi Hillel supposedly said, the real meaning of the Hebrew scriptures is just that you should love your neighbor. The rest of the scripture is just the explanation of that. Well, it turns out that's what Kant says too about morality. You know what a duty is? A duty is something you have to do just because it's the right thing to do. Right? You got to do the good just because it is good. Well, notice the thing about duty is that it is, therefore, an unconditional demand. It just says, you gotta do this. It doesn't give a reason, like it's not if you want to get something or whatever. It's just the fact that this is good and you gotta do it because it's good. Right? It's something that has to happen regardless of conditions. We all get that. But that means there's something revealed there about us. We are the kind of being that can recognize unconditional truths. What is that capacity? Well, Kant calls that reason, or he calls it Vernunft. We can use reason in English in all kinds of ways. We actually typically take reason to mean reasoning through something, figuring it out. That's not the thing you should think of here. By reason, the specific thing Kant means is that capacity to grasp something unconditional. So, by virtue of being, in that sense, rational beings, turns out we are able to feel the weight of moral imperatives. That also means that when you're grappling with a moral imperative, when you are encountering that unconditional demand just to do what's right because it's right, do what's good because it's good, you are yourself relating to that command from that unconditional perspective, which means you're not relating to it from the perspective that is aware of all the little details in your life, right? That thing in you, that aspect of you that recognizes the weight of that is indifferent to whether you're sleepy, whether you're poor, how old you are. All those things that are the specific conditions of your life are irrelevant to the perspective that you have that recognizes that moral imperative. So when you are thinking morally, you're thinking from that absolute perspective. You're not thinking from a perspective that's relative to your interests. And that means you're recognizing an imperative that isn't relative to your interests. Right? The moral imperative that we all recognize is one that commands absolutely, without qualification, or as Kant says, it's a categorical imperative. It just says, do this. It's not hypothetical. It doesn't say, if you want this, do this. It just says, do this. That's the first point. The second point is that even though the imperative itself isn't defined in terms of your particular interests or the particular conditions of your life or anything like that, nonetheless, if you're going to do that right thing, if you're going to follow that duty, you're going to have to do it within the terms of your life. So even though that imperative is not defined by any of the finite, conditioned aspects of your life, that infinite imperative nonetheless is only going to be realized by you in finite, conditioned ways. Right? You have to interpret that imperative finitely. And so Kant says, when it comes to fulfilling a moral duty, there's always, as he says, a playroom, a Spielraum, for realizing it. And that's because there is never any straightforward translation of the infinite into the finite. Right? So you're always going to have to figure out how, in this situation, to do the right thing. And you recognize lots of right things, like you need to tell the truth, you also need to protect this person, you also need to take care of whatever else, right? Those things are all many duties that you have. They're not your private interests. There are many duties that you have. And so when you are going to realize the good, you're going to have to exercise your good judgment to figure out how you can fulfill your duty while also fulfilling all your other duties. And that means it's always going to be a matter of you taking responsibility for how this infinite thing is going to be realized in finite terms. Right? And that, he says, that's what virtue is. Virtue is constraining yourself by morality. Virtue is, he says, the strength of your intent or your resolution, to bring the good into being in this situation where you're going to have to figure it out for yourself. So, though the categorical imperative is not defined in terms of the finite specificities of your life, it can only be realized in those terms. It's not okay for you to make exceptions to it because of something you want, but it is required that you figure out how to realize that in light of all the different responsibilities you face. Now, third point, that moral experience that you have is the same experience that any other rational being has, right? By virtue of their reason, in that sense we defined, every other person has that same moral experience. And that means, like you, every other person is a place where the good can be brought into being. And for that reason, your duty to recognize and be answerable to the good means you've got to recognize and be answerable to the moral reality of other persons. So as he says, that categorical imperative means always treat others as ends, not merely as means. But again, just as that infinite imperative has to be realized in finite terms, well, similarly, in dealing with another person, you're always going to have to involve them in relationships in the world, instrumental relationships in the world, and so on. So you're never going to be able to just magically find another domain where you deal with people morally. You're always going to be dealing with them in real terms. The issue is not to treat them merely as means, but in dealing with them in ways that do involve them as means, your responsibility is always nonetheless to be treating them as ends in that. So the ultimate meaning of that categorical imperative really is not to reduce morality to the terms of the world, but within the terms of the world to realize the good. And similarly, not to reduce another person to the mere terms of the world, right? But within the worldly terms in which you interact with them, to respect and recognize them as a site of infinite worth.